The phone rang at 6:47 in the morning, the kind of hour that only ever brought bad news. Sarah answered it with a dish towel still in her hand, milk already spoiled in a mug she hadn't had time to drink. "Is this Sarah Whitfield? I'm calling regarding the estate of Margaret Doyle." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret, her great-aunt. A woman she'd met exactly twice, both times at funerals for other people, both times exchanging nothing more than a stiff handshake and a few polite words neither of them meant. "She passed 3 weeks ago," the lawyer continued. "You've been named the sole heir to her property." Sarah almost laughed. Not from joy, from disbelief. She was 2 months behind on rent, juggling a daytime shift at a call center and nights restocking shelves until midnight, and now, apparently, she owned a house. "What kind of property?" she asked, already bracing herself. The answer came slow, careful, like the lawyer was choosing each word with tweezers. "A farmhouse. Earl. Decades of neglect. Back taxes owed. Condemned wiring the county had flagged twice. Neighbors, apparently, had taken to calling it the eyesore at the end of the road. It wasn't a windfall. It was a burden with a deed attached. She should have felt nothing. Instead, something tightened in her chest. Not hope. Not yet. Just the faint, unfamiliar sensation of being chosen for something, even something worthless. "There's one more thing," the lawyer said, and here his voice shifted, just slightly. "There were unusual stipulations in the will." Sarah frowned. "Unusual how?" A pause stretched too long to be comfortable. "It might be easier," he said finally, "if you came in person." The gravel driveway had long since surrendered to weeds, and the house at the end of it looked less like a home than a memory someone had forgotten to bury. Paint peeled from the siding in long gray strips. The porch sagged under its own weight. Somewhere beneath the smell of mildew and wetwood, Sarah caught something older, dust that had settled decades ago and never been disturbed. Inside, her footsteps echoed against warped floorboards. Sunlight slanted through grimy windows, catching drifting particles that hung in the air like the house was exhaling for the first time in years. Every room told the same story of abandonment, except the details didn't quite fit. In the kitchen, one section of flooring had been replaced with mismatched boards, nailed down tighter than the rest, as if someone had once needed to get underneath it and didn't want it found again. In the hallway, the baseboards were patched unevenly, but patched carefully, like the work of someone who cared more about concealment than appearance. Then she found the basement door. It was reinforced steel, bolted into a frame far sturdier than the crumbling walls around it, utterly out of place in a house otherwise falling apart from neglect. Beside it, a single locked room, its door untouched by rot, its hinges oiled recently enough to still turn without a sound. The will had named it specifically. Asterisk, not to be sold. Not to be entered by anyone outside the family. Asterisk. Sarah stood in the silence, dust settling around her, and felt the shape of a question she couldn't yet ask. This wasn't a house that had been abandoned. It was a house that had been guarded. News travels fast in a town with one gas station and one diner, and by the time Sarah got back to her motel room, her phone was already buzzing with numbers she didn't recognize. The first call came from a developer named Rick Halloran, his voice smooth in the practiced way of someone used to closing deals over coffee he didn't pay for. He'd heard about the Doyle place. He could offer cash. Today, if she wanted. No inspection necessary, no repairs required, just a number and a signature. The number was absurd. Nearly triple what a condemned farmhouse on dead land should have been worth. Sarah stared at the offer on her screen, waiting for the catch to reveal itself. It didn't. He just wanted an answer soon. Very soon. Before she could even process that, a second call came, this one stranger than the first. A man who wouldn't give a company name, only a title. Private collector. He spoke carefully, almost rehearsed, expressing interest in the property's history rather than the property itself. He, too, offered cash. He, too, wanted no walkthrough, no delay. 2 buyers. 2 wildly generous offers. 0 interest in actually seeing what they were buying. Sarah had spent enough of her life being underestimated to recognize when something didn't add up. Nobody paid premium for a house the county had condemned twice unless they knew something she didn't. She thought of the reinforced door in the basement, the patched floorboards, the locked room the will refused to let her sell. Whatever secret her great-aunt had spent a lifetime protecting, word of it had already reached people far outside the family. And they weren't just interested. They were desperate. Sarah set the phone down, hands trembling slightly, and made a decision. She wasn't selling anything, not yet. She spent the next 2 days clearing junk from the house alone, refusing every callback from Halloran and the man who called himself a collector. Boxes of moth-eaten linens, rusted tools nobody had touched in decades. A life reduced to clutter no one had cared enough to sort through. Until now. It was in the sitting room, near the cold hearth, that her crowbar caught on something that shouldn't have been there. One floorboard shifted under pressure that the others hadn't. Not warped, not rotted. Loose, deliberately, like it had been lifted and replaced more than once. Sarah knelt, heart quickening, and pried it up. Beneath it sat a small tin box, its edges eaten by rust, its lid stubborn with age. She worked it open with trembling fingers, and the scent of old paper and metal rose to meet her. Inside was a photograph, torn cleanly in half. A group of people standing in front of a building she didn't recognize, their faces solemn, their clothing decades out of fashion. Only one face remained fully visible, a young woman who bore an unsettling resemblance to Sarah herself. Beneath the photograph, a folded note, the ink faded but legible. Only a handful of words, written in a hurried, anxious hand. Asterisk, if they find it before we do, we lose everything. Trust no one outside the family, asterisk. And beneath that, half buried in the tin, a small brass key, ornate, old-fashioned, unlike any lock in the house. Sarah turned it over in her palm, feeling its weight far heavier than metal alone could account for. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. Someone once had been afraid enough to hide this, careful enough to protect it, and desperate enough to warn whoever found it next. The question that had haunted her since the basement door now sharpened into something urgent. What was worth protecting like this? The county archives smelled like every library Sarah had ever loved as a child. Old paper, dust, and the particular hush of forgotten things waiting to be found. She spent her lunch break there, then her evenings, then whole weekends she should have spent working a third job to keep the lights on. The house, it turned out, had a history far older than her great-aunt's ownership of it. Property records traced it back to 1926, built by a man named Elias Doyle, her great-great-grandfather, during the height of Prohibition. A local historian, a soft-spoken woman named Dinah, who ran the archive more out of devotion than duty, pulled a brittle newspaper clipping from a folder and slid it across the table. Local businessman questioned in federal raid. The headline read, dated 1931. Elias Doyle's name appeared in the second paragraph, brief and unexplained, as though the story had been quietly smoothed over before it could grow larger. Rum-running country back then, Dinah said. Half these old farmhouses had something underneath them. Tunnels, cellars, hidden storage. People built for concealment. But that wasn't the only layer. Deed records showed the property had changed hands again in the early 1960s, briefly transferred to a name Sarah didn't recognize, then quietly transferred back within 18 months.
No explanation.
No public record of why. Cold War era, Dinah offered, almost thoughtfully. Lot of rural properties like this got repurposed. Storage. Shelters. Things people didn't talk about, even after. Sarah sat back, the pieces refusing to align into a single, clean answer.
Prohibitionera concealment.
Cold War secrecy. 2 different centuries of America's fear layered on top of each other in the same house, behind the same reinforced door. Which secret was she chasing? Or the thought settled over her, heavier than either possibility alone. Was it both, one hidden inside the other, waiting for someone patient enough, or desperate enough, to finally? Dinah gave her one more name before she left the archive that day, Earl Winslow, 91 years old, the last living person in town who remembered the Doyles before the silence set in. She found him on his porch 2 towns over, wrapped in a wool blanket despite the summer heat, his eyes sharper than his frail hands suggested. When Sarah said the name Doyle, something shifted in his expression, recognition, and beneath it, something closer to caution. Your family, he said slowly, used to be somebody around here. Owned half the county, near enough. Fine house in town before the other house. Then it all just stopped. Stopped how? He was quiet for a long moment, rocking gently, choosing his words the way a man chooses which stones to step on crossing a river. There was talk. A scandal, money troubles, maybe federal trouble, nobody ever said outright. One year the Doyles were the wealthiest family in 3 counties. The next, they'd sold off nearly everything and gone quiet as church mice. Moved out to that farmhouse and mostly stayed there.
Didn't mix much after that.
Sarah felt something cold settle low in her chest. You're saying they lost everything? Earl shook his head slowly, and his next words landed harder than she expected. I'm saying that's what they let people believe. The porch went silent except for the creak of his rocking chair. Folks who really lose everything, they beg, they borrow, they complain, he said. Your family didn't do any of that. They just went quiet. And quiet, in my experience, usually means somebody's protecting something, not mourning it. Sarah sat with that long after she left his porch, the truth reshaping itself painfully in her chest. Her family hadn't lost their fortune. They had hidden it, deliberately, fearfully, and never told anyone why. The next morning, the house felt different before Sarah even reached the porch, a wrongness she couldn't name until she saw it. Fresh tire tracks cut through the gravel near the tree line, curving toward the back of the property where no delivery truck or neighbor had reason to go. She followed them on foot, her pulse climbing with every step. Near the foundation, the earth had been disturbed, not dug, not exactly, but pressed and prodded, as though someone had knelt there testing the ground for something hollow beneath it. A few feet away, one of the basement windows lay shattered inward, shards glittering in the grass like scattered teeth. Her stomach dropped. Inside, nothing appeared to be missing. But the reinforced basement door stood slightly ajar, a hair's width from how she'd left it, enough for her to know, with sick certainty, that someone had tried. Her phone rang before she'd even processed it. The collector again, his voice smoother than before, laced with a patience that now felt less like courtesy and more like control. I understand you're exploring the property's history, he said. That can be dangerous, Ms. Whitfield. Old houses like this hold things people have killed to protect. Once, I'd hate to see you learn that the hard way. The line went dead before she could respond. Sarah stood in the ruined kitchen, glass crunching faintly beneath her shoes, and felt the shape of her fear change completely. This had stopped being about a will, or a mystery, or even money. Someone believed whatever was hidden here was worth trespassing for. Worth threatening a stranger over. Worth watching a house in the dead of night, waiting for their chance. And whoever they weren't just circling anymore. They were closing in.
She didn't call the police.
Some instinct told her this wasn't a matter they'd understand. Not yet, not until she understood it herself. So instead, that same afternoon, she drove into town, bought a crowbar and a heavy-duty bolt cutter, and returned to the house with a resolve that surprised her. The locked room sat at the end of the hallway, small and unremarkable except for the door itself, thick, windowless, its hinges gleaming with oil far too fresh for a house otherwise frozen in decay. The brass key from the tin box slid into the lock but refused to turn, worn smooth by time or deliberately altered to fail. So she went to the bolt cutter instead. It took nearly 20 minutes of grinding effort before the old padlock finally gave way, clattering to the floor. Sarah pushed the door open, and stale, cold air rushed out to meet her, air that had been sealed away for years, maybe decades. The room beyond was smaller than she expected, empty except for a heavy iron hatch set into the concrete floor, its surface stamped with a symbol she didn't recognize but felt, instinctively, was older than anything else in the house. Reinforced steel edges. A wheel-lock mechanism, the kind she'd only ever seen in old documentaries about fallout shelters. Her flashlight beam trembled slightly as it traced the outline of the hatch. This wasn't a hiding place for a box of photographs and a note. This was built to withstand something. Built to conceal something people were terrified might be found, or terrified might be taken. The will's words echoed back to her with new, chilling clarity. Unusual stipulations, not to be sold, not to be entered by outsiders. Her great-aunt hadn't left her a house. She had left her a guardian's post, one final duty, passed down in silence, for whoever was brave enough, or desperate enough, to finally open what generations before her had chosen to bury. The letter arrived 3 days later, official letterhead stamped across the top, and Sarah's hands went cold before she'd even finished the first paragraph. A man named Preston Holbrook, attorney, representing a client identified only as a descendant of the original co-developer of the Doyle property, was formally contesting her claim to the estate. Buried in dense legal language was a single, devastating assertion that the underground structure recently disturbed on the property might fall under a historical preservation statute, or worse, remain subject to a decades-old ownership dispute never fully resolved by the courts. She called the number listed. Holbrook's voice was courteous in the way of men who'd never once needed to raise their own. My client's family, he explained, had a financial interest in what was built on that land, long before your great-aunt inherited it outright. If what's beneath that house has value, historical or otherwise, ownership isn't as simple as a will. Sarah's mouth went dry. You're saying I could lose it? All of it? I'm saying, he replied smoothly, that you should consider settling quickly, before this becomes public.
Before the county gets involved.
Before things become complicated for you. The threat wasn't shouted.
It didn't need to be.
It sat quietly beneath his politeness, unmistakable all the same. Sarah hung up and stood in the ruined kitchen, the iron hatch waiting patiently in the room down the hall, its secret still sealed beneath her feet. She thought of Halloran's suspicious cash offer, the collector's threats, and now a stranger's lawyer, materializing the very week she'd finally broken through to the truth, as if someone, somewhere, had been waiting for exactly this moment. Whatever lay beneath that hatch wasn't just historically significant. It was valuable enough that people were willing to fight her for it, in the dark and now in the courts. She didn't go alone. Dinah had insisted on coming. If there's history down there, I'm not missing it for anything, and brought along her nephew Marcus, a contractor with steady hands and a headlamp bright enough to cut through whatever waited below. Sarah was grateful for both of them, though nothing could quite steady the tremor in her own chest as Marcus wedged a crowbar beneath the iron hatch and heaved it open. The wheel lock groaned, resisting decades of rust, before finally surrendering with a metallic shriek that echoed up through the empty house. Cold air rose to meet them, damp, mineral, carrying the faint tang of old oil and older stone. A steel ladder descended into darkness deeper than their flashlights could fully reach. Sarah went first. Each rung was colder than the last, the air thickening around her the further she descended, until her breath came out in pale clouds despite the summer heat above. The tunnel at the bottom stretched narrow and low, walls reinforced with brick on one side, poured concrete on the other. 2 eras of construction, she realized, fused imperfectly together, exactly as the records had suggested. Old crates lined one wall, their wood soft with rot, stenciled markings long faded past reading. Beside them, rusted machinery sat frozen mid-purpose. Pipes, valves, a control panel with dials that hadn't moved in half a century. Marcus's light swept forward and caught something ahead, a heavy vault door, round and industrial, set into solid concrete like something built to survive far more than time. No one spoke. Sarah stepped closer, heart hammering so loudly she was certain the others could hear it, and ran her fingers along a small brass plate bolted beside the wheel. The same symbol from the hatch above, worn but unmistakable. Her gray-tant's warning echoed back to her. If they find it before we do, we lose everything. She placed both hands on the cold iron wheel, glanced once at Dinah, then Marcus, and began, slowly. The wheel resisted for the first few turns, then gave way all at once, the mechanism releasing with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Marcus helped her pull, and the heavy door swung open on hinges that shrieked in protest, exhaling decades of trapped, frozen air into their faces. For a moment, none of them moved. The chamber beyond was small, dry, meticulously sealed, untouched by the decay that had swallowed the rest of the house. Shelving lined the walls, and on it, carefully wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, sat the truth Sarah's family had guarded for nearly a century. Stacks of gold and silver coin, dulled but intact. Bundled cash from an era whose bills hadn't circulated in decades, still crisp inside their bindings. Jewelry, deeds, and, tucked into a metal document box at the center of it all, a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with Elias Doyle's careful handwriting. Sarah opened it with trembling hands, and the story unfolded exactly as Earl had hinted, exactly as the newspaper clipping had implied. Elias hadn't simply run rum during Prohibition. He'd built a smuggling operation that made him one of the wealthiest men in the county and powerful enemies alongside it. When federal agents began circling in 1931, he hid what he could, moved the rest into silence, and let the world believe the Doyles had lost everything, rather than risk it being seized, or worse, risk his family being targeted by men more dangerous than the law. Decades later, during the Cold War, a frightened generation reinforced what he'd built, adding their own layer of secrecy on top of his, never quite trusting that the danger, or the greed, had truly passed. Dinah's voice, when she finally spoke, was hushed with something close to reverence. "This isn't just money, Sarah. This is history. Real, documented history." Sarah stood in the cold, quiet chamber, surrounded by nearly a century of fear and sacrifice, and felt something inside her shift permanently. Her family hadn't been ashamed. They had been protecting her long before she'd ever been born. They surfaced into daylight that felt almost unfamiliar, blinking against the sun, still half lost in the cold hush of the chamber below. Sarah barely had time to process what she'd found before her phone buzzed with a voicemail that stripped the moment of any peace. The collector's voice, no longer smooth, no longer patient. "I know you've been in the tunnel. I know what's down there. You have 24 hours to reconsider my offer, Ms. Whitfield, or I'll make sure Holbrook's client has everything they need to tie this up in court for the next 10 years. You'll spend a fortune proving you own a fortune." Sarah's blood ran cold. That evening, headlights swept across the driveway as she and Marcus were reinforcing the basement door with fresh bolts. A car idled at the property line, too long to be passing through, too far to identify the driver. It pulled away only after Marcus stepped outside, flashlight raised like a warning. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, she'd made her decision. If they wanted to fight her in the open, she'd meet them there, publicly, decisively, before Holbrook's legal maze could bury her in delays designed to outlast her patience and her savings. She called Dinah first, then a historical preservation attorney Dinah insisted was the only honest lawyer in 3 counties. Together, they began building a case grounded not in fear or secrecy, but in the very thing her family had once tried to hide: documented, provable history. Elias Doyle's ledger, county deed records, sworn statements from Earl, from Dinah, from anyone who could confirm the Doyle lineage stretched unbroken to Sarah herself. If the collector wanted a quiet, private surrender, he wasn't going to get one. Sarah intended to drag every secret her family had buried into the light, on her terms, before anyone else could seize it first. The hearing took place 3 weeks later in a county courthouse that smelled faintly of old wood and floor polish, the kind of room built for decisions far smaller than the one about to be made inside it. Holbrook's client, it turned out, had no documentation tying his family to any legitimate ownership stake, only a verbal family legend, decades removed from fact, built on rumors that Elias Doyle had once had a business partner. The ledger told a different story: a partnership dissolved in 1930, a debt fully repaid in cash before the federal raids ever began, recorded in Elias's own precise handwriting. Dinah's research, Earl's sworn testimony, and a genealogist's confirmation of Sarah's unbroken bloodline closed whatever gap remained. The judge's ruling took less than 10 minutes to deliver. The estate house, land, and everything discovered beneath it belonged to Sarah Whitfield, sole legal heir, without dispute. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun felt different against her skin, warmer somehow, as though she were feeling it for the first time in months. The financial appraisal that followed in the coming weeks confirmed what she'd already suspected. The coins, the historical documents, the sheer rarity of an intact, verified piece of Prohibition-era history amounted to more money than she'd ever imagined seeing in her lifetime. Debts vanished. The job she'd hated, the anxiety that had lived permanently in her chest, both dissolved along with them. But it was the ledger she returned to most, in quiet moments, long after the noise of lawyers and buyers had finally faded. If they find it before we do, we lose everything. She understood now not a threat, but a promise, passed silently down through generations too afraid to speak it aloud. Her family hadn't hidden their fortune out of shame. They had hidden it out of love, sacrificing comfort and reputation to protect a legacy they prayed someone, someday, would be brave enough to finally uncover. Sarah closed the ledger gently. She forgave them completely. The restoration took nearly a year, but Sarah insisted on doing it right, not erasing the house's history, but honoring it. The sagging porch was rebuilt plank by plank. The condemned wiring was finally replaced, safely, without stripping away the old bones of the place that had stood guard over her family's secret for nearly a century. In the sitting room, she left one floorboard deliberately loose, a quiet, private joke only she would ever understand. She donated a portion of what she'd found to the County Historical Society, working alongside Dinah to build a small exhibit on Prohibition-era life in the region, Elias Doyle's story told honestly, at last, without shame woven into it. Earl came to the opening, leaning on his cane, smiling in a way that told her he'd been hoping for this outcome longer than she'd known him. She reached out, too, to relatives she'd never met, cousins scattered across 3 states, descendants of a family that had quietly drifted apart the moment silence became easier than explanation. Slowly, tentatively, they began finding their way back to each other, gathering that first Thanksgiving in the very house that had once threatened to divide them completely. Standing on the porch that evening, watching lamplight spill warm and golden through windows that had been dark for decades, Sarah thought about how close she'd come to selling it all sight unseen, to walking away from a burden without ever discovering it was a blessing in disguise. She thought, too, of everyone watching this story unfold from the comfort of their own homes, their own inherited clutter, their own overlooked corners. So if you've ever inherited a house nobody wanted, old, crumbling, dismissed as worthless, take a closer look before you let it go.
Check the floorboards.
Check the walls. You might be standing on more history and more legacy than you ever imagined.